The version of you that got hurt is still running your life, the moment you disappear from your own reaction. Someone raises their voice slightly during a disagreement that, by any reasonable measure, isn't serious. A misunderstanding about plans, a comment taken the wrong way. The kind of friction that exists in every relationship and resolves itself within minutes. But something happens in your body before your mind has time to evaluate the situation. Your chest tightens, your jaw sets. There's a specific kind of heat that rises through your neck and settles somewhere behind your eyes. And for a few seconds, sometimes longer, you're not entirely present in the conversation you're having. You're somewhere else, not literally. You haven't gone anywhere. But the version of you responding in that moment doesn't feel like the version of you that exists most of the time. The one who handles disagreements with reasonable composure, who can usually separate a small moment from a larger meaning. This version is faster, more defensive, more certain that something dangerous is happening, even though nothing in the actual room supports that certainty. Afterward, when the moment has passed and the conversation has moved on, you might feel a strange kind of confusion, not about what was said, about how you responded to it. The intensity doesn't match the event. You know this even as it's happening. There's a part of you watching the reaction unfold with a kind of detached bewilderment, thinking, this is too much for what's actually in front of me. That gap, between the size of the event and the size of your response, is one of the most reliable signals that something other than the present moment is operating underneath your behavior. Not imagination, not exaggeration, something specific and traceable. Most people interpret this gap as a personal flaw. They tell themselves they're too sensitive, too reactive, too quick to escalate. They feel embarrassed afterwards, sometimes for days. And that embarrassment becomes one more thing layered on top of an already confusing experience. Shame about a reaction whose actual origin was never understood in the first place. But here's what's worth considering before any of that shame takes hold. What if the person reacting in that moment wasn't entirely you, the adult, present, currently aged version of you, but something older? Something that has been carrying a specific kind of alertness since long before you had the language to describe what it was protecting you from. What if, in that brief window between the trigger and the response, an entirely different version of you took the wheel, one who has been driving in moments like this for far longer than you've noticed? And if that's true, if it's not entirely you responding, then who is? And where has this version of you been all this time? The wound that never got to finish. Here's something most people don't know about emotional pain, and it explains far more than it initially seems to. Pain that gets fully processed has a natural life cycle. It rises, it's felt, it's understood within whatever context produced it, and eventually it resolves into something the nervous system can file away, not erased, but integrated, completed, no longer requiring active management. But pain that occurs before a person has the cognitive or emotional resources to process it doesn't follow that life cycle. A child experiencing fear, abandonment, humiliation, or chronic instability doesn't have the developmental tools to make sense of what's happening to them. They can't contextualize it. They can't reason their way through it the way an adult might. They can only feel it, fully, overwhelmingly, and then do whatever is necessary to survive the feeling, usually by suppressing it, compartmentalizing it, or finding some adaptive strategy that makes the unbearable feeling temporarily bearable. The pain doesn't go anywhere in that process. It just stops partway through. It becomes what psychologists sometimes describe as a frozen experience, not because it disappeared, but because it never received the second half of what painful experiences require, the processing that allows them to be understood, integrated, and finally put down. Think of it like a process that was interrupted before it could finish saving. The file doesn't disappear. It just sits there incomplete, and something in the system keeps trying to complete it, searching for conditions similar enough to the original moment to finally finish the job. That's the mechanism behind a remarkable amount of adult emotional reactivity. The nervous system isn't malfunctioning when it responds intensely to something that seems disproportionate. It's running an old unfinished process, one that activates whenever current circumstances bear enough resemblance to the original unprocessed wound. The raised voice today doesn't need to be objectively threatening. It only needs to rhyme on some unconscious level with a voice that was genuinely threatening once, a long time ago, to someone who had no way to defend himself against it. This waiting state, pain that never finished processing, still searching for resolution through situations that echo the original wound, has a specific name in modern psychology. And once you understand what it actually is, certain patterns in your life will suddenly make a disturbing kind of sense. Why this younger self took the wheel without asking. The concept is sometimes called the wounded inner child, a phrase that has been used so casually in popular psychology that it's lost some of its precision. So let's be precise about what it actually means. It doesn't mean there's a literal child living inside you, separate from your adult self, occasionally taking control like some kind of internal hijacking. What it means is more specific, and in some ways more useful. Certain emotional and behavioral patterns, formed during childhood in response to specific painful experiences, remain operational in the nervous system long after childhood ends. They don't update automatically just because you've gotten older. They activate under conditions similar to their original formation, using the same emotional logic, the same protective strategies, the same urgency that made sense when you were genuinely powerless to protect yourself in any other way. Carl Jung wrote about something closely related in his exploration of psychological complexes, semi-autonomous clusters of emotion, memory, and behavior that operate somewhat independently within the larger structure of the psyche. A complex formed around an early wound doesn't simply sit passively in memory, it organizes perception. It scans the environment for anything resembling the original threat, and when it finds a match, even a loose, imperfect one, it activates with a speed and intensity that bypasses your adult reasoning almost entirely. This is why the response in Topic 1 felt so fast, so disproportionate, so resistant to your usual composure. It wasn't your adult judgment evaluating the situation and concluding that danger was present. It was an older system, formed under genuinely threatening conditions, recognizing a partial match and responding the way it learned to respond back then, because back then, that response kept you safe. This isn't weakness, it isn't immaturity, and it isn't something to be ashamed of. It's a protective system that once worked, doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem isn't that the system activated. The problem is that it never received the update that the original danger has passed, that you are no longer the person who needed that level of defense to survive. Which means the real question isn't why does this keep happening to me? The real question, the one that actually leads somewhere useful, is this. What is this version of you still trying to protect you from? The things you call personality that are actually defense. Here's where this becomes uncomfortable in a different way, because once you start looking for this protective system, you find it operating in places you never thought to question, places you've been calling personality for years. The caution that makes you reluctant to fully trust people, even when they've given you no specific reason for suspicion. The independence you take quiet pride in, the sense that you don't need much from other people, that you're better off relying on yourself. The instinct to create distance the moment a relationship starts to feel genuinely important, as though closeness itself were the warning sign rather than the goal. Most men describe these traits as simply who they are, strengths even, evidence of maturity, self-sufficiency, emotional control. And in some contexts, that description isn't entirely wrong. These traits can function adaptively, and there's nothing inherently broken about valuing independence or exercising reasonable caution. But it's worth asking a harder question about the specific shape these traits take in your life. Not whether you're independent, but whether your independence has room in it for genuine reliance on another person, without your body registering that reliance as danger. Not whether you're cautious, but whether your caution ever actually relaxes, even with people who have consistently proven themselves safe. Not whether you create healthy boundaries, but whether you create distance specifically at the moment a relationship starts to matter as a way of controlling the potential pain before anyone has the chance to cause it. When the answer to those questions reveals a pattern, when the independence never softens, when the caution never updates based on new evidence, when the distance always arrives right on schedule the moment something starts to feel real, what you're looking at usually isn't personality. It's defense, a strategy built by a younger version of you who learned, through specific and painful experience, that closeness preceded loss, that trust preceded betrayal, that needing someone preceded the devastating discovery that they weren't actually there when it mattered. That strategy made complete sense once. It may have been the only thing that made an unbearable situation survivable. But strategies formed under one set of conditions don't automatically know when conditions have changed. And the confusion between identity and inherited protection, mistaking the wound's solution for your actual self, is one of the most consequential things a person can fail to examine in an entire lifetime. Recognizing the defense is only half of what's actually happening here, though, because underneath every defense, there's something specific it has been protecting you from feeling, and that's considerably harder to look at directly. What's actually underneath the defense? Defenses don't exist by accident. They form around something. And if you trace the caution, the independence, the reflexive distance back to its source, what you usually find underneath isn't nothing. It's pain. Specific, located, and in many cases still surprisingly intact, despite the years that have passed since it was first felt. This is the part most people resist examining, and understandably so. Today it's far more comfortable to manage the defense, to simply be a cautious, independent, somewhat guarded person, than to make contact with what the defense was built to avoid. But the pain underneath doesn't disappear just because it's been successfully avoided for 20 or 30 years. It waits. And it continues to color present experience in ways that are easy to misattribute to current circumstances. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations about the discipline of perceiving things exactly as they are, stripped of the additional meaning that judgment and old association attached to them. He understood that human suffering rarely comes from bare events themselves. It comes from the interpretive layer added on top of events, often without our awareness that we're adding anything at all. Applied here, that discipline reveals something specific. The pain you feel today in small ordinary moments, a friend cancelling plans, a partner seeming distant for an evening, a colleague offering criticism more bluntly than expected. That pain is often not actually about the present situation. It's the original wound, still unresolved, borrowing the present moment's circumstances to express an intensity that belongs to something much older. This is why the reaction feels disproportionate. It is disproportionate if you're only measuring it against what's happening right now. But it's not disproportionate at all if you understand that it's actually a response to two things simultaneously: the small thing happening today and the much larger thing that happened years ago and was never given the chance to be fully felt, understood, and released. This is difficult to sit with. There's no way around that. Making contact with old pain, really feeling it rather than managing it from a safe emotional distance, is uncomfortable in a way that defense mechanisms are specifically designed to prevent. But understanding this distinction, even intellectually at first, opens a door that most people never realize exists. The door between reliving an old wound indefinitely and actually finally resolving it. The difference between reliving and resolving. This is the distinction that determines whether someone spends decades managing the same patterns or eventually moves through them. Reliving looks like progress because it's active. You feel the intensity, you respond to it, you process it in whatever way feels available in the moment. Maybe through anger, maybe through withdrawal, maybe through an explanation that makes sense of your reaction after the fact. But none of that activity actually resolves anything if the underlying wound never gets directly acknowledged. You can relive the same pain for 40 years and feel each time like something significant is happening, without ever actually closing the loop that's generating the pattern in the first place. Resolving is different. It requires something most people instinctively avoid, a direct, conscious encounter with the original feeling, separated from whatever present-day situation triggered it. Not analysis, not understanding the psychology of it, though understanding helps. An actual felt acknowledgement of what the younger version of you experienced, without rushing past it, minimizing it, or immediately converting it into a lesson before it's been allowed to simply be what it was. In practice, this starts with something small and immediately usable. The next time you notice a reaction that feels disproportionate to what's actually happening, the tightening chest, the flash of anger or withdrawal that seems too large for the moment, pause before acting on it. Not to suppress it. To ask a single specific question, is this about what's happening right now, or does this feel familiar in a way that goes back further than today? That pause is the entire practice. The Stoics built an enormous amount of their philosophy around exactly this gap, the space between an event and your judgment of it, between a stimulus and your response. Epictetus described this gap as the location of all human freedom, not the ability to stop things from happening to you, but the ability to insert a moment of awareness between what happens and how you respond to it. That moment of awareness is what gives your adult self enough time to recognize when an older version of you has taken the wheel, and gently, without force or self-judgment, take it back. Giving the wheel back. The version of you that got hurt doesn't need to be eliminated. That was never the right goal, and chasing it would only create another layer of self-rejection on top of an already difficult situation. He's not an enemy. He's not a flaw in your character. He's a part of you that experienced something real, at a time when you had no resources to handle it any other way than the way you handled it. What he needs isn't to be erased, he needs to be acknowledged. He needs someone, and at this point in your life that someone is you, to finally turn toward what happened and say clearly and without flinching, I see what you went through. It was real. And it makes sense that it shaped you the way it did. That acknowledgement is what allows the protective patterns to finally soften. Not because you've decided to be braver or more disciplined, but because the system was never trying to sabotage you. It was trying to protect a wound that nobody had properly tended to. Once that wound receives genuine attention, not perfect resolution, just real attention, it stops needing to hijack every situation that even loosely resembles the original danger. This doesn't happen instantly. It happens through repetition, through noticing again and again when an old pattern has taken the wheel, through pausing again and again in that small gap between trigger and response, through gradually teaching your own nervous system that the danger which shaped you back then is not the same as the situation in front of you now. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not to an audience, which is part of why the meditation still feels so honest 2,000 years later. He wasn't performing wisdom. He was practicing it, daily, often imperfectly, often returning to the same struggles because understanding something once is never enough to dissolve it permanently. That's not failure. That's what the actual practice of self-awareness looks like. Not a single moment of enlightenment, but a recurring, deliberate return to clarity every time the old patterns resurface. So here is where you begin. Not with a complete resolution of everything this video has touched, just with one moment. The next time something small produces a reaction that feels too large, pause. Ask the question. Let the gap between the trigger and your response be wide enough for your actual adult self to step back in. The version of you that got hurt has been driving for a long time. He's tired, even if you've never thought of him that way. And the kindest thing you can do, and for him, and for the life you're actually living right now, is to finally take the wheel back, not by force, by attention, by the simple repeated act of noticing when it's him responding and choosing gently to respond as yourself instead. That's where it starts. Not with everything resolved, just with one moment fully seen. If you made it to the end of this video and something in it felt uncomfortably familiar, that recognition matters more than it might seem right now. It usually means something true was just named for the first time. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if this kind of conversation is something you want to keep having. And leave a comment, not as a formality, but because I genuinely read everyone. Many of the topics that end up here started exactly that way, in something someone shared that hadn't quite found words yet anywhere else. Because that's really what this channel is for. A place where the things that are hardest to look at get looked at anyway, without judgment and without rushing past them. You are not the only one carrying a version of yourself that never finished healing. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.